Hi, I'm Laura and this is Tropetrinitytrilogy, and today on Writing with Tropes, I'll be discussing setting. First, I'd like to thank fancylong for requesting this video 6 months ago. I'm sorry it took me so long. Obviously, I've been on hiatus. Actually, it's probably been more than 6 months because I'm pre-filming. So like a year ago, my bad. Also, I'd like to say I renamed my Trope Talk series to Writing with Tropes. So even though I'm gonna be calling it Writing with Tropes from now on, it is Trope Talk. Now back to our regularly scheduled Trope Talk, or I guess I should say Writing with Tropes. So I could just list the different parts of setting that you need to take into account when creating a world. However, that's been done quite a bit before. If you just want a straight up list of different aspects of a world to consider while creating your setting, I'll link Bookish Pixie's video below. Lists things such as flora, fauna, culture, religion, architecture, and all those other things you should take into account when creating a world. Instead of just listing those things, I'd rather talk about how setting can be interwoven with plot and character. I'd also like to say I've linked 3 different TV tropes pages below. The first is setting, which is literally just a list of different types of settings. The second is setting gimmicks, which is literally just a list of gimmicks your setting can have, such as everything is trying to kill you and a world limited to plot, both of which could be creative and interesting choices or poor writing, which with these 2 examples I gave, they're usually just poor writing. Finally, the third is setting as character. This is when the setting actively interacts with the characters, such as a spaceship with AI or a haunted house. An example of this is the ship Alexander in Illuminae, which is controlled by the AI Aiden. And by making the AI control the ship, this sort of gives the setting a sort of living aspect. Also, I have a picture of the spaceship right here. So that's the Alexander living setting example. Also, I have a map of the Zelda map. Another setting. Don't try to figure out which game this is. It's just a bunch of different ones blobbed together. So yeah, but it's cool. Anyway, back to the discussion. First, I'd like to say when creating a setting, it's important to take into account that every single aspect is interwoven and one change can have a domino effect of changes. Just think about how one thing could change our world. Do you think that if for centuries we had contact with aliens, magic powers, or whenever someone died they became zombies, that our world would be the same? How would it affect our religions, politics, even how we power our homes? And in turn, how would this affect the natural world, such as the climate and environment? I highly doubt a world with aliens, magic, or zombies would be in the state it is in now. It is important to think about these things if you want your world to feel both realistic and unique. Because the truth is, a lot of books, they just change one thing and leave everything else the same, which isn't particularly as interesting. So if you do take into account how these things will affect the rest of the world, it can make your story's world stand out. It's also important to make sure that the idiosyncrasies of our world do not affect the world of your story. If your story takes place in a world with no concept of God whatsoever, people shouldn't be saying OMG. It's also important to take into account how the natural environment and human civilizations play off of each other. A culture created in a desert versus a mountain versus a rainforest should all be very different. And also the flora and fauna of a world inhabited by magic wielding nomads versus a steampunk empire should be very different. The point is, everything is interconnected and you can't change one thing without having a domino effects of changes on the rest of the world. And at the end of the day, you shouldn't just default to our world's climates and cultures. Another thing that's important to note is how different cultures affect each other and how their histories affect each other. 2 cultures that are allies versus enemies versus one culture having been isolated for centuries should all be very different within themselves and how they treat each other. Also, I would like to encourage you to try to be creative, because the truth is, there tends to be a general setting that a lot of books have similar to each other. Your fantasy doesn't need to be a monarchy with dragons, and your sci-fi doesn't need conveniently human-like aliens and evil AI. Be creative and think outside of the box. In fact, one book I think that has a really unique world is The Vagrant by Peter Newman. It's a sci-fi fantasy post-apocalyptic world overrun by demonic creatures that can possess corpses. And though because of this world being so unique, it took more for the author to get me understand the creatures he created and the structure of everything, it was well worth it in the end to get to experience something so new. And I highly recommend you try to think of your own creatures and your own structures of the world, because at the end of the day, that's something that could really make your writing and your setting stand out. Now this is really unique, and he went all the way thinking of different cool things these demon-like creatures could do. And I highly recommend this book, and I love it, and it's one of the most unique worlds I ever read. Back to setting. However, I will like to say, if your story's political structure and magical elements or technology seems common, that doesn't mean your story is a lost cause. How you use these elements and weave them into your own unique plot with your own unique characters can really make your story stand out and will make these elements your own. There's no need to panic. Second, I would like to state that characters should definitely 100% be products of their environment. I've read so many books that take place in dark, gritty worlds where every single protagonist and good guy has convenient modern American values. It's like authors want to be edgy and gritty with their dark world, but then they sort of cop out and create a character with modern American values in fear that either people won't like their protagonist or people will just be upset that the character doesn't express all their same values and they think the book is terrible and evil. Which is a real problem, I will say. But even though it is risky, I highly recommend you let the corruption of the world affect your characters. Because at the end of the day, everyone is a product of their environment. And when writing a character, they should be a product of the setting they were raised in. For example, Winston from 1984 is very angry and indoctrinated, and he's not likable. But he fits the story of the world, and the story wouldn't have as great of an impact if he wasn't the way he is. I encourage you, if you're writing a dystopian with a totalitarian government, to actually write characters that are indoctrinated, because it is much more interesting and powerful to read about a character who has the flaws of their world and learn to either overcome them or they end up succumbing to them, as opposed to reading about a character who is a perfect moral beacon with convenient modern American values for no reason, and then just condemn everyone else. Not only will giving these flaws to your character make your message stronger, it will also make your characters feel more human and morally gray like real people are, because no one is actually perfect. I'd also like to discuss how the setting should affect the characters and plot within the present of the story and individual scenes. A lot of times the setting of a story is just a backdrop for the rest of the events to occur, but it can be so much more than that. It can be a cause of conflict, a tool for characters to utilize in a situation, or something that reflects an aspect of the character. A great example of how setting can cause conflict within the present of the story is the movie Hidalgo. Hidalgo is about a half Native American man trying to save the painted horses from slaughter by entering a great race in the Saudi Arabian desert to win enough money to buy their freedom. Both the fact that the setting is a culture he's never known and an environment he's never known causes great conflict for Hidalgo. Many stories have moments where the author adds in random conflict that just seems like a way to keep the reader entertained. But by utilizing the setting, you can add in conflict that fits the world and feels like it flows naturally with everything, as opposed to having conflict that comes completely out of left field. So obviously a race across the desert is interesting enough, but to keep the story interesting with things constantly happening, Hidalgo gets tangled up in the feuds between the groups living in the Sahara Desert. He has to deal with sandstorms and locusts, and since it's a desert and wells are few and far in between, when he gets to them, there tends to be assassins or dangerous people waiting for him. This not only allows the conflicts throughout the story to feel natural to the world, but also allows the setting of the Sahara Desert to go from a backdrop to an imposing force. And I highly recommend to let your setting, especially if it's one your character is unfamiliar with, to be a force against your characters. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum from setting being a force against your characters, setting can also be an asset to them. An example of how setting can be an asset to your character in an individual scene is Disney's movie Moana. In Moana, there's a scene where her and Maui are trapped in the lair of Tamatoa, a giant crab who wants to kill them. So at first it seems hopeless. However, when Tamatoa covers the top of his lair and plunges it into darkness, Moana realizes that there is algae growing throughout the cave. So to escape, Moana takes some of that green glowing algae and puts it on a barnacle to trick Tamatoa into thinking it's a heart of Te Fiti. She then uses this to distract Tamatoa so her and Maui can escape. Now this is a small example that's only in one individual scene, but this is also a good example of how your setting can be an asset to your characters in a scene. And the third thing is that setting can highlight different aspects of your character. For example, in the Hunger Games, there is a scene when Katniss first gets to the Capitol and she's scrolling through different images that can be displayed in the window of her room in the Capitol. She scrolls through different ones and finally stops at one of the forests. And this forest reminds her of the one at her home where she would hunt. This is a great way for Susan Collins to highlight how this is where Katniss is most comfortable and feels safe, and how she's homesick without just outright stating those things about Katniss. And that's just one way how you can use the setting to highlight aspects of your character. And finally, I'd like to add that your setting does not have to be stagnant throughout the story. And in fact, I highly suggest you change your setting throughout the story. Whether these changes are caused by the shifts of seasons, your characters going to different planets, or the oncoming of the apocalypse, your setting doesn't have to be stagnant throughout the story. And by utilizing these small to big changes, you can really make your setting come to life. Because in reality, living, breathing worlds do change over time. And also, don't be afraid to let the events of your plot change your world. A great example of setting drastically changing because of plot is the manga Berserk. Berserk starts off as a fairly average medieval fantasy world. I mean, it's pretty dark with the things people do to each other, but the world itself is pretty normal. However, then there's a point in the story where one of the main characters, Griffith, gets tortured to the point that his body is pretty much permanently ruined and he can never achieve his dream. So in order to live his dream and heal his broken body, Griffith uses a necklace he's been wearing for a while to summon the demon apocalypse, which plunges the world into a demonic hellscape, resulting in almost every single character we know and love being slaughtered, and the ones that do survive being permanently scarred mentally and physically. Yeah, people defend his actions. And though this could turn off some readers, this is a really ballsy move and makes Berserk stand out. And though you don't have to be this extreme, I highly recommend you consider having some changes to your world that your readers don't expect, because it can really make your story stand out. So to summarize the main points I've made in this video: 1. All aspects of the world should be interwoven. 2. Try to be creative. 3. Characters should be products of their environment. 4. Let the setting play an active role in the plot. Let it inhibit the protagonist, help the protagonist, and reveal deeper insights to the protagonist. And 5. Don't be afraid to let your setting change over time. But anyway, that's all I have to say about setting for now. Anyway, I really hope this was enjoyable and helpful for you. And if you have any comments, questions, or things you'd like to discuss, feel free to say them below, because I would love to hear them. But anyway, I really hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you later.